Okay, so National Theatre Wales was set up, opened in 2010, with the goal, I guess, of revolutionising, in a way, theatre practice in Wales. And this is what we started off by doing. So that's a quick overview of some of the theatre practice of NTW. I knew it would be. Oh, it wasn't Tom Bearshaw, it was Kevin.
What is so actually revolutionary about National Theatre Wales in terms of, you say, revolutionising the theatre culture of Wales when, you know, for goodness knows how many years there's been all sorts of radical, interesting companies doing all sorts of stuff, site-specific, all over the place around Wales, and you quite successfully have brought in some of those very radical artists like Mike Pearson. So what do you consider is really radical about what you've done?
I think the part of a job of a company like NTW is to bring the radical currents and bring the exciting currents together and give them a prominence and in a way a sort of visible narrative. So a story around these things. And I think you're absolutely right that there was we drew absolutely on the practice that had been going on around site-specific work, around community engagement, around visual theatre, as you can see in a lot of that stuff. But actually maybe pulled it into a story that was about theatre in Wales, at least for today. And I think that I certainly wouldn't say that NTW was solely responsible for, but has been a part of, I think, a really thriving independent theatre scene in Wales, encouraging young artists, encouraging emerging talent. I think that is partly a response to having that bigger narrative there, that big story where we can say, this is what theatre in Wales looks like, and it's different to elsewhere. It's certainly different to across the border. So in that sense, I think it was pulling those radical currents together into a kind of revolutionary sense of the bigger picture.
So I'll disrupt now. Does that mean that you're more about consolidating a revolution? More of a Napoleon character?
I don't think you can consolidate a revolution. So I think it always has to be open to disruption, and I think those currents of disruption have to be there. So I've sometimes made the joke that one of our jobs maybe was to stir up other people to almost, in a way, even disagree with our practices, to say, I don't like that thing that NTW just did. I'm going to do my own that's going to be completely different. And that would be, in a way, one of our best signs of success. I sort of hope that it's not always as kind of black and white as that. But I do think that a big part of our job is to get people stirred up about their own practice and wanting to do things and seeing possibilities that we've missed, and moving into those gaps and making something wonderful and surprising happen. You don't get two disruptions, Tom Beardshaw. Can't disrupt yourself. I'll take that one at the end if it's okay. I think in answer to both Kevin and Tom, I think what I want to do now is talk a little bit more about, well, what is the politics within this? Specifically, what's the practice that informs not all of that theatrical endeavour, because some of it's just about creating a beautiful moment or about imagining our emotional lives in a different way, but there is a politics underpinning it as well. And there's three elements of that politics and that practice that I'd like to particularly highlight today. One is and absolutely crucial for us as a company, and maybe surprising for a national company, is a strong sense of the local, a real engagement in what the local is and what that means for theatre. The second, and equally important, is the way that the local builds into networks. How do we connect things and people? And the third one, which perhaps we talk about a little bit less, but I'd like to talk about today, is a sense of history, both the history of the past and the history of the future as well. And I think when we talk about revolution, it's always about a moment in time, it's always about a shift, and therefore history always has to be part of the picture. So I'm going to start by mentioning a show that we just did, the most recent show that we had on, which is a piece called Mother Courage, and it's a very famous play written by probably the most well-known left-wing or revolutionary writer of the 20th century, Bertolt Brecht. And it's often staged as quite a grand production, and there are certain ideas about how you should stage it, certain theories of Brechtian theatre. In the 1980s and probably before, a lot of good and well-meaning theatre companies would do tours of shows like Mother Courage and Bertolt Brecht, maybe to different communities across the country, trying to stir up revolution through the messages of the play. In some ways, what we did with that play might seem an echo of that kind of practice. In some ways, indeed it was, in that we chose to stage the play here at Merthyr Tydfil Labour Club, which is a fantastic, still very functioning labour club, full of day-to-day business and very good cheap beer. And we wanted to do the piece in a way that had a real conversation with that space. So like a lot of the work that we saw in the video, that was about the place and the things that go on there. So rather than taking this story from the 20th century, from Bertolt Brecht, and sort of using it as a way to explain things to people, we rather spent a whole month in the venue rehearsing the play and discovering what the venue and what the space and what the people who use that space had to say to us about that play. So we staged a lot of scenes behind the bar. The famous Brecht songs that were part of the play were done as karaoke numbers, and the audience could also have a go and do their own karaoke numbers during the show. And really importantly, we had a chorus of fantastic local women alongside 9 professional actors. There were about 20 local women who came along to rehearsals, gave their opinions on how we were playing it, what we were doing, and were part of the numbers. So this is a scene where a whole bunch of soldiers in the play staged quite a rude drinking song, and that instead was taken over by the women of Merthyr Tydfil. I won't even repeat the words of the song that they were singing, but it was pretty shocking. And that group of women, since the show, is now going on to form their own theatre company, Keep Meeting, with our support in Merthyr. The play ends with a very famous scene where Catherine, who's the daughter of the Mother Courage character, the main character in the play, has been, she's a young woman who can't speak. We had her played by an older actress, Sharon Morgan. She's a young woman who can't speak, and doesn't actually act much during the play. Right at the end of the play, she does something very brave. She climbs onto the top of a peasant's house and beats a drum to wake up the local town to the fact that there's an army approaching, and that if they don't respond quickly, they might all end up dead. So we staged that on the roof of Merthyr Tydfil Labour Club, and there's Sharon Morgan banging her drum on the roof of Merthyr Tydfil Labour Club. I think a really interesting thing came up here. Although the show in general was well received by the critics, The Guardian had a real problem with this scene. So The Guardian, the great Labour, not Labour, but slightly left of centre sometimes newspaper, had a difficulty because we played this scene the day after, it was like 2 days after the election that they saw it. And of course, it had just been a Tory landslide. And we played this scene and not only had Sharon on the roof of the Labour Club waking up the town to revolution, we had a sound cue that made it sound like the church bells in Merthyr Tydfil were waking up and were playing the tune of the red flag, bursting out of Merthyr. Now, The Guardian thought that that was ill-conceived and inappropriate the day after a Labour landslide. That was the day after a Tory landslide. That was their big overview. But if you look at it from a local viewpoint, Merthyr Tydfil as a town had just won, a Labour MP had won, having defeated quite a strong campaign from UKIP in that town. And of course, Merthyr Tydfil's also the town where the red flag was first raised in the world as a revolutionary gesture. Guardian didn't seem to know that. I think that's the distinction between a local politics and a kind of universalizing one. For us at NTW, that local is always central. Haven't had any disruptions for ages. Very quickly to look at a couple of other local projects that can be very, very different. So this is not all about, you know, towns that we might associate maybe more with revolution like Merthyr Tydfil. So we did a beautiful project up in Snowdonia that worked with the shepherd communities there and their stories and their lives on that mountain and what those mean today. This is a scene in which one of the performers walks up a red, not a red flag in this case, but a red carpet that marks the scar on the mountain where a tram used to go and take the slate back down for the slate mining industry. Very importantly, with a piece like that, not everyone can get up to or onto Snowdon. We also broadcast work online, and this was a live cast of that show, so you could follow the journey up the mountain online. We'll talk a little bit more about online networks later. And sometimes it's about, in a way, giving voice to communities that haven't been listened to or even noticed. So a big ongoing project that we've done really throughout the life of NTW has been with the communities in Bute Town in Cardiff. We did a very early piece called The Soul Exchange, which explored through an audience taxi ride the stories of that very multicultural community, and one that often people don't associate with Wales, and certainly not with something called National Theatre Wales. People might have a very set idea of what that means. For us, it was important that it was about a full range of communities. That's the finale of that show. But alongside a lot of our shows, we also do a project called The Assembly, which is an opportunity for local people to decide an issue that they'd like to debate. And we'll run that alongside or sometimes in conversation with shows. And in the Assembly that we had in Bute Town, alongside that production, The Soul Exchange, the big issue was about the treatment of particularly young Somali men in that community. And after that assembly, a bunch of those young men came to us and asked if we could make another show that was about their experience. As they put it rather brilliantly, everyone sees us as pirates. Those are the image that we see on TV. But we want to explain to the world that we're not pirates, we're poets. So these young guys, who are mainly poets and rappers, did a big production with us called De Gabe, which had its finale in the Senedd building, and actually took over the Senedd with Somali poetry and song for the evening, and ended up with a huge puppet poet heading out into the bay. As I say, the local is central to us, but how you join that local up into networks is equally important. There's one of our young poets, Ali Gouliad, who's now a member of the board at NTW and therefore my boss, so I have to be careful what I say about him. But he's taken part in an event we ran as part of National Theatre Wales team. And National Theatre Wales team is a network of all the people who've been involved in those local projects, or anybody who wants to be, to set up their own projects, to be in touch with each other, and to create a bit of a movement across the country. So team runs events. So this is a team event up in Wrexham. I think that this one was a spoken word night. And it also connects with people in less obviously artistic ways. So again, through Ali, we actually sponsored a football team. So you can see that next to the Nike slogan, next to the Nike logo, there's the National Theatre Wales website address on the soccer team's shirts, so that this is, we think we're the first national theatre company to have sponsored our own football team.
Can I stop there, John?
Yeah.
So, it's all beautiful, it's all bright lights, but as we know, there's another side to pretty much every coin. What's been the dark moments for you? Only last night, Lenny Henry walked off on first night of Educating Rita. Have you ever felt like walking off yourself? Which project got your goat and you thought, I've had enough of this and thrown it in?
I think this project I've just been talking about with the Somali community was one of the most challenging that we've had, because I think that's a community that's often felt incredibly marginalised, and in Bhutan in general actually there's been a lot of arts projects that have gone in, done something, very nice photos, put them in the annual report and then buggered off. So there was a lot of distrust. And there were times even when there were disagreements within the communities that we were working with about how we should work and what we should do. So at one point, for example, the project was about to be boycotted by the Somali elders. And I ended up in a meeting that lasted a couple of hours talking about how the project was working and why. And in the end, I actually don't think that there'd been a huge shift of opinions. But I think the main thing that happened was that myself and a couple of colleagues and some of those young men had spent time talking with the people who were upset about the project. And it took a couple of hours. And just the fact that we were spending time to talk made all of the difference. So I think loads of time, if you're doing any work that's going to disrupt or going to have an impact, you are going to have these really difficult moments. And the key thing actually is not to walk off, but to sit down and go, okay, we have to go through this again, but let's spend the time on it.
Do you think that they felt on some level a mistrust and that people were almost trying to exploit them?
Absolutely, and I think that arts organisations often do exploit communities, sometimes in a quite knowing way. Actually, yeah, we do need nice pictures of the annual report, or funders want us to do this, so let's do it. Sometimes in a less knowing way, you know, that it's a well-meaning project, but you haven't actually understood what's needed. And that second case will happen all the time. It will happen to us, but again, it's about spending the time to listen and find out what's going on. I'm talking about our group of women in Merthyr. You know, the key to that project isn't actually what happened in the Labour Club and what happened with the show. It's actually what happens next, and how do we support that group of women in what they now want to do in a town that is often misrepresented through programs like Skint, etc., in really quite drastic ways. So it is about spending the time. And going back to Tom and Kevin's point, in a way, you know, we're one of the least rich national theatre companies that you'll find, but we do have, you know, proper resources in the sense that we are a national company. So we can sometimes do that follow-up in a way that might be harder for smaller groups or individuals. So again, creating networks like NTW Team that support people with their follow-up is really important. That's a little bit more. Oh, this is now one of the projects that I mentioned before, National Theatre Wales Assembly, where we talk about local issues. This has now grown into a project that it'd be great for you to keep an eye out over the next few months, actually, called the Big Democracy Project. So we're now running assemblies across Wales that highlight a variety of local issues. This was one in Bangor that looked at voter apathy. And for the evening, everybody involved set up their own political parties. And that's going to build towards an event that's taking place in March at the Senedd building again, where we're going to be looking at what democracy means in Wales and the issues that people have and want to raise. I think the key thing with the Assembly, though, and the way that it's turning into the Big Democracy Project, is that it focuses a lot on local or individual issues and why they're important to people. And again, looking at the theme of revolution. Revolution, I think, doesn't happen through generalized sentiments. It usually happens because people are riled up about something very specific that's happening in their communities. So the most recent section of the Big Democracy Project happened in Llandudrod Wells on Friday last week, where we worked with an organisation called KELF, and they were looking at cuts to disability benefits, and a lot of disabled artists were creating an evening of work with us. And again, that's something that a lot of people maybe barely register, but for the community that it's crucial to, is having really life-changing effects. And for me, those often hidden stories are crucial to any politics in the work. Really importantly, the Assembly also exists online, so that you vote for the next project in the Big Democracy Project by going to the website and selecting one of the proposals. So it's open, it's very local, but it's open to a wider community. And for us, an online community for the company has always been central. So Tom Beardshaw, one of our disruptors, worked with us to create this. Before we'd ever created a show at National Theatre Wales, we created this online community. And crucially about this community, yes, it talks about our shows, yes, it features our artists, but anyone can join and anybody can highlight their work. Equally importantly, that the productions themselves need to be networked as well. And one of the ways that obviously we do that through live casting is through live casting. Possibly our most overtly political piece was a show called The Radicalisation of Bradley Manning. It's about Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, the young soldier who leaked all of the Iraq, Afghan and embassy materials to WikiLeaks. Whoops, I've skipped forward. Yes?
Is live streaming, is that stopping audiences coming to shows?
We have never found that it has. So with Bradley Manning, as you see there, that's the website that we used for it. There's never been a public performance of the Bradley Manning show that hasn't been live cast at the same time, and that's because we felt that this story was one very much about the way in which information is released digitally, so only to do it for 200 people in a theatre space felt antithetical to the very act that Manning was doing. But the audiences for this happen across the world. So there's been, is it 36 different countries, Tom, that we had during the first one? 72, there you go. 72 different countries. Obviously, a lot of those people wouldn't have been able to come to the show. I think by and large, it's expanding. But equally importantly, as you'll see in here, we encourage people during a live cast like this to talk to each other. With this show, we even had people who were featured in the show, so people like David House, the political activist, coming on to the chat to chat about the show with people who are watching it while it's being live cast. So we encourage a kind of interactive and networked behaviour, not a polite sitting at home watching theatre, but it's on your computer. We encourage people to behave differently. Some of the shows that we have had a massive impact. Probably the one that has registered most globally is one that we did called The Passion in Pwllgorfa, not least because it featured at its heart the actor Michael Sheen, who's much loved not just in Wales but throughout the world. But this piece also relates a lot to the final element that I wanted to highlight in terms of our practice, which is a relationship to history, and as I said, the history of the past and the history of the future. The Passion was a reimagining of the Passion story, Christ's Passion, over the Easter weekend, but it wasn't at all a religious piece of work. It was an incredibly secular and political piece of work, taking that story and reinventing it for Pwllgorfa today. And as many of you will know, Pwllgorfa's the town that a lot of us drive past on the M4. It's often derided even for the way that it's supposed to smell, for its economic history, for being emblematic in a way of a lot of the industrial decline in South Wales. But it's also an extraordinary town full of amazing people, great stories, and the birthplace of some of our greatest actors, not least Michael Sheen, Anthony Hopkins, and of course Richard Burton, close by at least. So Michael reimagined that history of the town, but he reimagined it by also playing with the future. So he created a version of The Passion in which a big corporation was coming to take over. Bye-bye, Kevin. Was that a disruption? A disruption by leaving is good. Great. I'm back on disruption now. So in a way, Michael was kind of disrupting our idea of the Passion, but also disrupting the history of Podolba, because he worked both with that religious story, but also a lot with local people. And this, I think, is an emblematic story of that show. This is a scene that takes place on a street called Llewellyn Street in Podolba. And Llewellyn Street is a street of Victorian terraced houses on one side, and on the other side, the Victorian terraced houses have been knocked down and replaced by the M4 motorway. So it's literally the street on which people pass over Podolba. So in Michael, she's disrupted now. I think she might win the award. So in that piece of work, what Michael was interested in doing was telling that story in a way that related to the history. So this is a mixture of professional actors and local people who are imagining the stories of the people who live in the houses that have now been passed over by the motorway. But at the same time, he created a sense of local revolution where people were coming out in their thousands to be part of this story and ultimately to rebel against this evil corporation that was in the story taking over Podolba and creating an even bigger Passover. Those of you with religious sensibilities will see what he did there. To a road that would drive over the town and ultimately eliminate it. And what you got during that performance was everybody in the town really participating in a narrative that was imaginary, but at the same time felt very politically grounded. Another political piece, yeah, go for it.
Obviously when you're involved in the public, there's a lot of unknowns, and a lot of planning, I imagine, went into it. But did it, in the end, come out as something that you thought it would, or did it sort of shift and become something different?
I think with the Passion, it became something beyond what anybody had expected, because I think that everybody wanted to involve local people in the telling of the story, and there were 1,000 local people involved in performance, and they wanted to make a strong political comment on how Podolba's been treated. But I don't think what people quite imagined was that the whole town would end up getting involved, literally everybody in the town. Plus, it trended all over the world. It was one of the first theatre shows back in 2011 to really trend on Twitter and really have Twitter as a major way that it was being distributed. And again, a big part of that was to do with Tom helped us set up a group of citizen bloggers, so local people, predominantly young people, but not only, who would make videos of what was happening and post them online, so that the stuff started to circulate and really went viral. And you can never predict what goes viral, but actually, I think in contemporary times, revolution is often about what does go viral. Another piece that worked, I've just got two more quick things to talk about. Another piece that worked for us online and in real space, and was also about that kind of imagining of a political history and story, was a piece called Border Game, which took place in November last year, and it imagined a world in which the Autonomous Republic of Cymru had closed its borders to the people of England, who now lived in an area called the New UK, or Nuke, of course, in England, without the support of Wales, the economy had collapsed, and badgers were running rampant, and the NHS had been privatised. So people were trying to sneak their way into the Autonomous Republic of Cymru, including refugees from other countries. So we created a piece where the audience had to be smuggled across the border on First Great Western trains from Bristol Temple Mead Station to Newport. They registered online with escape migration services, who sorted you out. Basically, they were people traffickers. And there's a brilliant site there that you can still see that tells you shortage occupations. Wales was short of miners because all of the miners had been de-skilled, and we decided to reopen them in this story. It took place right at we researched this piece for 2 years, and it ended up taking place right at the moment that Scottish independence referendum was happening, and right at the height of UKIP rising. So it became, for a moment, the most relevant theatre piece you could be doing. But really importantly with this piece, as well as the real life audience trying to cross the border, you could sign up online as well. But if you signed up online, you weren't a refugee trying to get across the border. You were an active citizen patrolling the borders of Wales through CCTV cameras. There you go. And deciding which of the actual audience should be allowed into the country or which of them should be chosen as a terrorist. So there was one of our audience members, the most credible threat. And if you were chosen as a terrorist, you were taken into detention. And ultimately, that poor audience member, the online players would decide whether they were released, detained, or executed. And you can see this poor guy here isn't doing too well. As with Bradley Manning, we encouraged lots of online interaction. And it was really interesting. People really got into the game element of this, but actually the comments at the end were the interesting ones, because people would then really analyze their own behavior and talk about how easy it had become, particularly online, to slip into a aggressive kind of right-wing patriotism that basically was trying to stop people getting in. One of the key little political points with this, of course, is that a lot of people thought that we'd chosen the terrorist in advance and that somehow we were pushing the online players to choose the right person. The online players absolutely chose the person, and the politics of that was, you know, the terrorist is the person that you decide is the terrorist. Yeah.
I have to ask, so we've had Labour clubs and red flags. Is your revolution that way?
I think that we're about to look at one more example that probably would give the answer, that would imply the answer is yes. But I think that what I'm trying to do in this talk is not talk about a political standpoint, but talk about a political process. So in the ideas of looking deeply locally, building up networks, and looking at the histories of the past and the future, actually, there's nothing about those things that is inherently left-wing. You know, if you come from a left-wing perspective, you might say the more you look into questions like that, you're at least going to be overturning some of the big right-wing or conservative narratives that we're often given today. But I would say, you know, overturn them from your own perspective, not from mine. However, I'm going to end with one story that is perhaps my favourite consciously revolutionary show the National Theatre Wales has done, which is a piece that we did with Griff Rhys called Praxis Makes Perfect. Did anybody see this piece? Yeah, a few people. It took place in Cardiff and then went off to London, Berlin and other places. But it was basically a theatrical staging of Griff and Boom Bip's album Praxis Makes Perfect. And it imagined or told the story of the Italian communist millionaire publisher, Giangiacomo Feltrinelli. So if you're trying to find a space between left wing and right wing, that's a good one. And it did it through the music and through various scenes that showed the life of that publisher. So there's Griff on stage, and there's the performers creating a revolution. And Giangiacomo Feltrinelli, he published Dr. Zhivago and made a huge enemy of Stalin. So in that sense, he was disrupting the left-wing orthodoxy of the time. But he also became mates with Che Guevara and tried to save him in Bolivia. And there's Che about to cause his own revolution. But my favourite moment in this show was one of the smallest, and perhaps one of the smallest and most intimate moments that I've talked about today. And it was a moment towards the end of the play, or towards the end of the performance. All of the audience had been asked to come along with a book that they really loved, but that they were willing to share with somebody else, that they were willing to give to somebody else. And amazingly, virtually everybody did. And at the end of the play, or the end of the performance, after this mad, manic story of Che Guevara and Stalin and Dr. Zhivago and Italian communist millionaire publishers, a sign came up on the wall. As some of you will know, Griff Rhys is famous for his signs. And it said, go find a stranger. And then it said, give them the book that you brought and tell them why it's important. And suddenly in this room, and it had been like a big, massive warehouse party, suddenly in this room with music blasting and blaring, suddenly in this room you saw a bunch of individuals go and find other individuals, people that they didn't know, and hand them a book. and talk to them about why that book was important to them and why it had changed their lives. And for me, that intimate, that small moment was one of the most revolutionary that we created, because it was about connections between people who didn't know each other. It was about why things mean something and matter to us. And it was about a very simple but still important message that even reading can be resisting. Thank you very much.